Vincent van Gogh is one of the most recognizable artists ever. His work can be found on just about everything. One of the more surprising things about him, though, is the timeline in which his work was created. His post-impressionism work, done in the iconic bright colors and thick visible strokes of paint, make up only the last 3 years of his life. Before the bright colors that he became known for, he used dark, earthy tones to create his first major work, the Potato Eaters. Vincent van Gogh's brother Theo provided Vincent with financial support while Vincent tried to break into the art world, something that he was famously unsuccessful at. Theo was constantly giving his brother tips to help improve his art, which he knew a great deal about since he worked as an art dealer. One of the tips that he gave Vincent was to improve the way he did figure drawing, which he did by obsessively creating sketches until they improved. Vincent admired the works of artists like Jean-François Millet, Georges Michel, Jules Breton, and Joseph Israels, who painted landscape scenes, peasant life, and laborers working. Van Gogh was drawn to these works and had early aspirations to paint this type of imagery. In 1883, Van Gogh had moved to the town of Nuenen in the Netherlands, where he lived with his parents.
Welcome back.
The relationship between Van Gogh and his parents was often strained, as they did not support his career or lifestyle. Nuenen was full of laborers, farmers, and weavers, and was the perfect place to practice figure drawing. Van Gogh spent months working long hours to try and capture the working class people, producing over 200 sketches and paintings. One of the first subjects to fascinate him were the weavers that worked in the town, although drawing the large looms that were kept in small spaces proved to be difficult. Van Gogh had met painter Anton van Rappert years earlier in Brussels, and the two considered each other friends. In May of 1884, after he began renting out a studio, he invited Van Rappert to Nuenen to paint with him. Van Gogh introduced Van Rappert to the weavers that he had obsessively been painting, and they painted them together while also looking for new subjects. One of the subjects that they found was a young peasant woman named Gordina de Groot, who Van Gogh would commission to model and also become friends with. During Van Rappert's visit, they painted watermills, churches, and more peasants, following Theo's advice to make his brother's work more appealing to potential buyers. Another of Theo's comments was that Vincent's color choices were too drab.
It's a little drab, I think. It looks a little drab.
And that he should take an impressionist approach with his paintings. Vincent was strongly opposed to this idea, feeling that the impressionists were more charm than substance. In an effort to defy his brother, he used even more grays and blacks in his paintings, and made them darker. Vincent used the words of painter Joseph Israels to justify his dark palette. Start with a deep color scheme, thus making even relatively dark colors seem light. Later that year, Van Rappert returned to Nuenen and inspired Van Gogh again to find commercial success. He started a series of works called Heads of the People, where he painted whoever he could convince to sit for him as a model. By December 1884, he had filled the walls of his studio with peasant studies featuring many people throughout Nuenen. He painted one after another, working as quickly as possible and using large brushstrokes to minimize the time spent on each painting. By February 1885, he had drawn more than 50 heads, and the idea for the Potato Eaters began to take shape.
Let's go.
In March of 1885, Theo offered to submit a painting to the Paris Salon, which was the most important art exhibition in Europe. After years of demands from Theo, Vincent finally had an opportunity for his work to gain exposure, something that he wanted desperately. Shortly after Theo made this offer, Vincent and Theo's father, Doris van Gogh, passed away. Vincent had made early sketches for the Potato Eaters around this time, with the idea to create a scene of peasants gathered together. The idea behind the painting was more than likely inspired by another painting done by Joseph Israels in 1882, called Peasant Family at the Table, which Vincent had seen back in The Hague. Following his father's funeral, Vincent moved into his studio, where he lived in conditions similar to the peasant people that he was studying. He avoided anything that a peasant would find luxurious, often wearing tattered clothing and sleeping on the floor of the studio's attic instead of his bed. He spent long hours painting the workers in the fields during the day and continued working in his studio after he returned. Van Gogh did many studies of the de Groot household and at least 20 portraits of Gordina de Groot. He created 3 surviving studies of the potato eaters prior to his final artwork, as well as a lithograph of the work. He constantly and obsessively reworked the final version of his painting until it was completed in late April and sent to Theo in May of 1885. The Potato Eaters is an interior scene of a cottage that captures 5 people gathered around a table for a meal, consisting of potatoes and coffee. The family depicted is the de Groot family, although Van Gogh wasn't focused on capturing the family's likeness. Instead, he wanted to capture the universal feel of peasant life. The first thing that stands out about the painting is how dark it is overall. The black windows in the background, as well as a clock in the upper left displaying 7 o'clock, suggest that it's nighttime. A gas lamp hanging from the ceiling is the only light source in the scene. It is also the brightest area of the painting, which draws the viewer into the next focal point, the family members. Their faces are well lit, and their somber facial expressions can be easily read. Van Gogh uses negative space around his subjects to clearly separate them from the background. Rough, bony hands and faces enforce the idea that these people have earned their meal through hard work. In a letter to Theo, he explains that he tried to emphasize that those people eating their potatoes in the lamplight have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, and so it speaks of manual labor and how honestly they earned their food. I wanted to give the impression of a way of life quite different from that of us civilized people. Therefore, I am not at all anxious for everyone to like it, or to admire it at once. This painting was the first major work that Van Gogh created, and he had difficulties with certain aspects. This can be seen in the imperfections in perspective and human anatomy. The slightly caricatured faces, different sized limbs, misplaced shoulders, and the positioning of everything in the scene seems slightly off. Although he had done many studies of peasant people, putting them all into one scene had its own set of challenges. In another letter, he wrote, "It would be wrong to give a painting of peasant life a conventional polish. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine, that's not unhealthy. If a stable reeks of manure, alright, that's what a stable is all about. If a field has the smell of ripe corn or potatoes, or of guano and manure, that's properly healthy, especially for city dwellers. Such pictures might prove helpful to them, but a painting of peasant life should not be perfumed." The colors that Van Gogh uses are intentionally dark and earthy. Although the overall composition appears to be made up of grays and greens, he used a wide range of colors that can be found in smaller details. Vibrant spots of green, red, and yellow are sprinkled around the figures. Hints of blue and purple can also be found amongst some of the more muddy browns, greens, and yellows. He told Theo that his flesh tones had started out looking more yellow and red, but he had repainted them to something like the color of a really dusty potato, unpeeled of course. Compared to the painting Peasant Family at the Table, The Potato Eaters is a much more intimate composition. Instead of viewing the family from a distance, Van Gogh puts the viewer up close, with the edges of the painting barely extending past the man on the left and woman on the right. The low ceiling above and the table below contain the painting, while the lighting and architecture create implied lines that guide the viewer around the room. The composition appears almost symmetrical, with 2 figures on either side of the table. Small details add to the scene, such as a religious painting on the wall and the kitchen utensils hanging from the ceiling. A mix of broad and narrow brushstrokes are used together to add to the balanced appearance. Van Gogh uses thicker, loose brushstrokes on places like the clothing or walls, but finer lines for highlights that are most noticeable on hands and faces. Van Gogh wanted the Potato Eaters to be his big entry into the art world. Instead, it was met by criticism.
Horrible. Just horrible.
Theo endlessly critiqued the painting, commenting on the flawed anatomy of the figures, muddy green colors, and dark lighting. He sent examples of more successful artists of the genre, like Léon Lemaitre and Fritz von Uda. Theo first showed the painting to Charles Seurat, a fellow painter and friend. Seurat agreed with Theo that the painting looked amateurish, although he also commented that the painting had potential. Van Gogh's friend Anton van Rappert also criticized the painting for the same reasons. In a letter, he wrote, "You will agree with me that such work is not meant seriously. Why did you see and treat everything so superficially? How far from true is that coquettish little hand of the woman in the background? And why isn't that man to the right allowed to have a knee, a belly, and lungs? Or are they located in his back? And why must his arm be a yard too short? And why must he do without one half of his nose? And why must that woman on the left have some sort of little tobacco pipe stem with a little cube at the end for a nose?"
Could I really be alive?
Van Rappert's comments infuriated Van Gogh, and would lead to the end of their friendship.
We're not friends.
Van Gogh left for Paris the following year, where his work shifted towards the iconic bright and colorful palette that he is best known for. He would continue to defend the potato eaters, and his thoughts on the painting stayed with him. In a letter to his sister 2 years later, he said, "What I think about my own work is that the painting of the peasants eating potatoes that I did in Noonan is, after all, the best thing I did." Following a mental breakdown in 1889, he was admitted to an asylum in Saint-Rémy-du-Provence in southern France. Here, he made plans to create a second version of the painting, including a drawing in 1890. These plans were never realized, as Vincent van Gogh was tragically killed by a self-inflicted gunshot wound in July of 1890. The potato eaters remained in the possession of the Van Gogh family from just after Vincent's death until 1962. It then became the property of the Vincent van Gogh Foundation, and it is now on permanent loan to Amsterdam's Van Gogh Museum. The Potato Eaters, although initially criticized, is today one of Van Gogh's most famous works, in addition to being the artist's personal favorite. His most famous work, Starry Night, was one that he considered to be a failure. So what is your favorite work by Van Gogh, and is The Potato Eaters in the top 10? How do you think it compares to the works that followed? Any thoughts you have about this artwork, please let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please support this channel by liking and subscribing.